I didn't faint when I found it. I didn't scream either. I just sat on the edge of our bed, holding a paper that calmly announced the date I was supposed to die. That was the morning I learned my husband had already planned my funeral, while I was still alive. My name is Doris, but you can call me Dory. I'm 74 years old now, with hands that shake a little when the weather turns cold and memories that still arrive as sharp as broken glass. If you're listening to my voice today, I want you to do one small thing before we go any further. Tap the like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. Not for the algorithm, dear, but because it tells me someone out there is listening. And after keeping this secret for more than 40 years, I think I'm finally ready to tell it. I've told myself many times that some stories are better left buried. But the truth has a way of knocking gently at first, then louder, until it rattles the bones of your life. This is one of those stories. I still remember the smell of that morning, clean cotton sheets, a faint trace of Old Spice cologne, and the burned coffee I'd forgotten on the stove. It was late autumn, the kind where the sun looks pale and tired, like it's already thinking about leaving. My husband had gone out early, said he had errands. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the drawer. I wasn't snooping. Let me say that clearly. I was looking for a pair of winter stockings, the thick wool ones my sister had sent me from Ohio years earlier. They were always in the bottom drawer of his dresser. Always. But when I opened it, the stockings weren't there. Instead, I found a manila envelope. Thick. Heavy. My name typed neatly across the front. Dorison Whitmore. My full name. The one only banks, hospitals, and death certificates use. I laughed softly at first. What on earth? I said to the empty room. I assumed it was some old paperwork. Insurance maybe. My husband, Harold, liked to keep things organized, too organized, some would say. Inside were several papers. Legal-looking. Visual. And then I saw the word that made my breath disappear. Obituary. Not a draft. Not handwritten. Typed. Final. It began with my name. My birth date. My hometown. My parents' names, both already gone by then. Mention my church. The women's auxiliary. Even the peach pie I was known for at summer picnics. And then halfway down the page, as casually as if it were a grocery list. Date of death, October 14th. That was 6 weeks away. I remember sitting down hard on the bed, the paper trembling in my hands. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. A strange, hollow confusion that felt like standing in the wrong house and realizing none of the furniture belonged to you. Maybe it's a mistake, I whispered. Maybe there's another Doris. But there wasn't. Every word was me. I had lived with Harold for 32 years by then. Raised 3 children with him. Cooked his meals. Washed his shirts. Stood beside him at funerals, weddings, graduations. And yet, here I was reading about my own death like it was already decided. The room felt suddenly unfamiliar. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had. Even the sunlight coming through the curtains looked wrong, too bright, too cheerful for what I was holding. I folded the obituary carefully. Very carefully. As if it might bite me if I moved too fast. That was the moment I realized something chilling, something that would change the way I saw my marriage, my past, and even my children. Someone I trusted had been preparing for a world without me in it. And they hadn't told me, because they didn't plan for me to survive long enough to ask why. I didn't confront Harold that day. No, dear. I did something much quieter. I put the papers back exactly where I found them, closed the drawer, and went on with my morning as if I hadn't just read the date of my own death. Because when you're a woman of my generation, you learn early that survival often begins with silence. And what I discovered next was far worse than the obituary itself. After I put the papers back in that drawer, I stood in the hallway for a long time, just listening to the house breathe. That old house had a way of settling and sighing, like it carried its own memories in the walls. I had always found comfort in those sounds. That morning they felt like whispers. I washed my hands at the sink, though they weren't dirty. I smoothed my hair in the hallway mirror and practiced my face, pleasant, calm, familiar. Women like me learned long ago how to hide storms behind a polite smile. By the time the kettle whistled again, I had tucked the knowledge of my obituary somewhere deep inside my chest, where it burned quietly. To understand why that paper shattered me so completely, you need to know the life I believed I had lived. I was born in 1950, the youngest of 4, in a clapboard house that smelled of starch and cinnamon. My mother ironed everything, even pillowcases, And my father came home every evening with grease under his nails and a tired smile meant just for her. We didn't have much, but we had routines, and back then routines felt like promises. I met Harold Whitmore in the summer of 1969, the year everyone talked about change but most of us were too afraid to touch it. I was 19, working part-time at the public library, my hair pulled back with a ribbon. Harold was 5 years older, already steady in his job at the municipal office. He wore pressed shirts and spoke softly, like a man who didn't want to take up too much space. He courted me properly. Flowers on Sundays. Letters written in neat cursive. Dinners where he asked about my thoughts, my dreams, my favorite books. When he proposed, he didn't kneel, he simply took my hands and said, "I'll take care of you, Doris. Always." In those days that sounded like love. We married in 1971 in my parents' church, with yellow roses and a borrowed veil. I remember the smell of floor polish and perfume, the way my mother cried quietly into a handkerchief. Harold squeezed my hand during the vows so tightly my fingers tingled. I thought it was nerves. Now I wonder if it was possession. Our early years were modest but happy. A small rented house. Second-hand furniture. Music drifting from the radio while I cooked meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Harold liked his dinners on time and his shirts folded a certain way. I liked pleasing him. That was what good wives did. Children came quickly. 3 of them, each one changing the shape of my days and nights. I became a mother the way my own mother had, fully, completely, with no space left over for myself. The house smelled of baby powder, boiled bottles, and later pencil shavings and peanut butter sandwiches. Harold worked longer hours as the years went on. He said it was for us. For the children. For the future. I never questioned it. When he came home tired and quiet, I gave him peace. When money was tight, I learned how to stretch a dollar until it nearly snapped. By the late 1970s, we owned the house I would eventually read my obituary in. A neat place with a maple tree out front and a drawer full of secrets I didn't yet know how to imagine. From the outside we were respectable. Church on Sundays. School events. Neighborhood barbecues where Harold laughed just loud enough and I passed around my peach pie, earning smiles and compliments. People called us solid. Dependable. Lucky. And for many years I believed them. But even then, though I didn't have words for it, there were moments that didn't sit right. Harold had a habit of going quiet when I asked about finances. He handled all the paperwork, said it was easier that way. Sometimes letters came addressed only to him, which he tucked away quickly if I walked into the room. I told myself it was nothing. Men were private. Marriage meant trust. By the early 1980s, the children were older, the house quieter. I found small pleasures, gardening, baking, volunteering at the church. Harold seemed distant at times, preoccupied but never cruel. Never unfaithful as far as I knew. And certainly never dangerous. That's the thing about betrayal, dear. It doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it wears a familiar face, eats at your table and kisses your forehead goodnight. As I moved through that day, folding laundry, dusting shelves, setting out Harold's favorite mug, I kept thinking about that obituary. About how carefully it had been written. About how well someone knew my life. And for the first time in decades, a question slipped into my mind that made my stomach tighten. What if the life I remembered wasn't the life Harold had been living at all? Because a man doesn't write his wife's obituary by accident. And something told me, that paper in the drawer was only the beginning. After that morning I began to live 2 lives at once. There was the life everyone saw, the polite wife, the tidy house, the familiar routines. And then there was the quiet life inside my head, where every sound felt sharper and every detail carried weight. Once you read your own obituary, you don't move through the world the same way again. You start noticing what doesn't belong. The first thing that truly unsettled me wasn't another paper or letter. It was money. I had always been careful with our household budget. I kept a little ledger in the kitchen drawer, next to the rubber bands and takeout menus. Groceries. Yes. Church donations. I didn't control the main accounts. Harold said it was complicated, but I knew roughly what came in and what went out. One afternoon, a few weeks after I found the obituary, I went to deposit a birthday check my sister had sent me. The bank smelled like ink and floor cleaner, the way banks always did back then. The teller was a young woman with kind eyes. She typed for a moment, then frowned slightly at the screen. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, lowering her voice, "are you aware of this withdrawal?" She turned the monitor just enough for me to see a line of numbers that made my throat tighten. It was more money than I'd ever spent at once. More than groceries, utilities, and church tithes combined for months. I shook my head. There must be a mistake. The teller hesitated, then smiled politely. It was authorized from your joint account. Joint. Such a comforting word, isn't it? It implies togetherness, equality, safety. I left the bank with my hands trembling inside my purse and a strange heaviness in my chest. All the way home I tried to explain it away. Maybe Harold had paid off a loan. Maybe he'd moved money around for taxes. He was practical like that. Still, when I pulled into our driveway and saw his car wasn't there, relief and dread washed over me at the same time. That evening I watched him closely as we ate dinner. He talked about the weather. About a coworker retiring. About nothing at all. His fork scraped against the plate in a steady rhythm. When I mentioned the bank just casually, his jaw tightened for half a second. Just paperwork, he said. Nothing for you to worry about. I nodded. I always nodded. But that night after he fell asleep, I lay awake listening to his breathing. The man beside me felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a stranger wearing my husband's face. I thought about the obituary again. About how organized it was. About how prepared. A few days later I found the second thing. It was a phone call. I answered the house phone one afternoon while folding towels. The voice on the other end was male, professional, careful. May I speak with Mr. Whitmore regarding the policy update? He asked. What policy? I said. There was a pause. Papers shuffling. The life policy, he replied. The one recently amended. My fingers tightened around the receiver. You'll have to call back, I said quickly and hung up before he could say another word. Policy. Amended. That evening I waited for Harold to bring it up. He didn't. Instead he kissed my cheek and asked if I'd remembered to defrost the chicken. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Confrontation requires certainty and I was still drowning in questions. Then came the envelope. It arrived in the mail on a Thursday mixed in with catalogs and bills. Plain white. No return address. Inside was a single typed page. No greeting. No signature. Everything is in place. Stick to the date. That was all it said. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the paper flat beneath my palm as if it might try to escape. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Outside, a lawn mower droned somewhere down the street, ordinary life carrying on while mine quietly cracked. When Harold came home I asked him carefully if he was expecting any unusual mail. He didn't even look up. No. That night I hid the envelope in my sewing box, beneath spools of thread and old buttons. I told myself I needed proof. I told myself I was being sensible. But deep down a terrible thought had begun to take root. The obituary wasn't a mistake. It was part of a plan. And the most frightening part wasn't that my husband might want me gone. It was that he believed I would never find out. After the envelope I stopped sleeping properly. Sleep used to come easily to me. Years of raising children trained my body to rest whenever it could. But now my nights stretched thin and brittle. I lay beside Harold, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his breaths. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed how still I was. Sometimes I wondered if he was counting too. During the day I became an observer in my own life. I watched the way Harold moved through the house, confident, unhurried, as if nothing in the world threatened him. I watched how he locked the front door twice before bed now. How he began taking briefcases to work instead of folders. How he answered the phone in the hallway with the door closed. None of these things were dramatic on their own. That's how danger hides, dear. It disguises itself as small changes easily dismissed. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf in the living room, I knocked over a framed photograph. It was an old one, Harold and me on our 10th anniversary, smiling stiffly in front of a restaurant neither of us could afford anymore. As I bent to pick it up, something slipped from behind the frame and fluttered to the floor. A key. Not a house key. Not a car key. Small. Silver. Carefully labeled with a tiny red tag. Unit 317. I sat back on my heels, the carpet rough beneath my knees. My first thought was storage. People rented storage units all the time. Holiday decorations. Old furniture. Things they didn't want cluttering the house. But why hide the key behind our anniversary photo? That evening when Harold came home, I held the key loosely in my hand and asked him about it as calmly as I could. Oh, that, he said, barely glancing at it. Work-related. Must have slipped out. I smiled. Of course. We were both lying now. The difference was only one of us knew it. As the weeks passed, I began to notice how often Harold spoke about the future. A future that didn't include me. He talked about downsizing. About simplifying things. About how hard it was to care for someone as they aged. He never said my name when he said those things. He didn't have to. Once over dinner he mentioned how expensive long-term care could be. Some people don't plan ahead, he said, shaking his head. They leave a mess behind. I felt my appetite disappear. Is that what you think I'd do? I asked lightly. He reached across the table and patted my hand. A gesture that once felt loving now felt rehearsed. Don't be silly, Doris. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom with the faucet running, the way women have cried for generations so no one would hear them. I started keeping a diary then. Not for poetry or memories but for facts. Dates. Times. Things said and done. I wrote about the key. The envelope. The money. The obituary. I wrote because I was afraid my own mind might betray me next. One afternoon while Harold was at work I finally did something brave or foolish depending on how you look at it. I drove to the edge of town to a row of low beige buildings with metal doors and gravel driveways. Storage units. My heart pounded as I walked past rows of locked doors, the numbers painted black and neat. When I reached 317 my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the key with both hands. The lock clicked open easily. Inside, the unit smelled of dust and oil. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. There were boxes stacked neatly against the wall, labeled in Harold's handwriting. Legal, medical, personal. I opened the first box. Insurance papers. Policies. Beneficiaries. All of them listed Harold Whitmore as the sole recipient. I opened the second box. Medical documents. Letters. Test results. Some of them weren't mine. The third box held something that made my knees give way. A black dress. Conservative. Church appropriate. With a receipt tucked inside the pocket. Funeral attire. Purchased in advance. I sat on the concrete floor and pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. In that moment the truth finally took shape, not as a single thought but as a crushing certainty. This wasn't about love gone cold. This wasn't about care or concern. This was about control. And money. And a man who had decided my life was inconvenient. When I locked the unit and drove home the world looked different. Brighter somehow. Sharper. As if a veil had been lifted even though what lay beneath it was terrifying. Harold greeted me that evening with a smile and asked how my day had been. Fine, I said. And for the first time since I found my obituary I realized something important. He thought I was still the woman who would never question him. He was wrong. There is a moment, dear, when fear changes its shape. It doesn't leave you, not really, but it stops sitting on your chest and starts standing at your back instead. Pushing you forward. That moment came to me on a quiet Tuesday morning, while I stood at the kitchen sink peeling apples for a pie Harold had requested. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I realized then that I was no longer afraid of knowing. I was afraid of pretending not to. After the storage unit, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness but into clarity. Every memory rearranged itself. Every kindness I had accepted without question now carried a shadow. And yet, strangely, I felt calmer than I had in weeks. I began to prepare. Not to run. Not to scream. Not to accuse. But to survive. The first thing I did was visit the library, the same one where I'd worked as a girl. The smell of paper and polish wrapped around me like an old friend. I sat at a wooden table and read everything I could about life insurance, beneficiaries, and spousal rights. I took notes in my neatest handwriting just as I had taught my children to do with their homework. I learned that policies could be changed quietly. That signatures could be forged. That older women were often dismissed as confused if they spoke up too late. That last part stayed with me. I started making copies of bank statements, letters, insurance documents I found tucked into Harold's briefcase when he showered. I hid them in places he would never look. Inside old cookbooks, beneath linen drawer paper, taped inside the hollow back of a clock that hadn't worked in years. Each small act made me stronger. At the same time I became softer at home. Kinder. Quieter. I laughed at Harold's jokes. I made his favorite meals. I played the role he expected because it kept me safe. But I watched him. I noticed how he checked the calendar more often now. How October dates were circled in pencil. How he once asked casually if I'd thought about updating my will. I trust you, I said sweetly. He smiled. That smile told me everything. One evening, as we sat in the living room watching television, he mentioned a doctor's appointment he'd scheduled for me. Just routine, he said. At my office. Easier that way. My heart thudded once. Heart. I already went last month, I replied gently. Remember? Dr. Collins said I was in excellent health. For the briefest second, so brief most people would miss it, panic flashed across his face. Oh, he said. Right. Of course. That night, I wrote in my diary until my hand cramped. I wrote because I needed proof that I was still sane. That this was real. That I wasn't imagining the careful tightening of a net around my life. I reached out to my sister next, not with accusations but with memories. I asked about childhood things only we would know. I asked her to send me copies of old letters. Birth records. Anything that anchored me to the truth of who I was. Then I did the hardest thing of all. I told myself that no one was coming to save me. Not my children busy with their own lives. Not the neighbors who saw only a respectable couple. Not the church which preferred peace over disruption. If I wanted to live, I would have to choose myself. The day before my supposed date, Harold came home unusually cheerful. He brought flowers. He suggested we go out to dinner. He touched my shoulder as he passed, his hand lingering just a moment too long. You seem well lately, he said. Almost lighter. I smiled. So do you. That night after he fell asleep, I packed a small bag. Not to leave forever but to be ready. I tucked my diary inside. The copies. My sister's letters. I hid the bag in the trunk of my car beneath an old blanket. Then I stood in the driveway for a long time, looking at the house I had given my life to. I wasn't running. I was waiting. Waiting for the right moment to step out of the story Harold had written for me, and into one I would finally write myself. The night before October 14th arrived without ceremony. No thunder. No warning dreams. Just the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway and the hum of the refrigerator, faithful as ever. I cooked dinner like I always did, roast chicken, carrots glazed with honey, bread warmed in the oven. The ordinary has a way of disguising the extraordinary. Harold ate quietly, his appetite hearty. He even poured me a glass of wine, something he rarely did on weeknights. You should relax, he said. You worry too much. I smiled into my glass. At my age, I said softly, I've learned worry doesn't change much. He nodded, satisfied with that answer. Later, as we prepared for bed, he lingered in the bathroom longer than usual. When he finally came out, his face was carefully blank. Too careful. He kissed my forehead and turned off the lamp. Good night, Doris. Good night, I replied. I waited until his breathing deepened. Then I lay there, fully awake, listening to the house. Every sound felt magnified, the settling wood, a car passing somewhere far away, the faint whistle of wind through a loose window frame. Sometime after midnight I heard him move. He slipped out of bed quietly, the way someone does when they don't want to be noticed. I didn't stir. I didn't open my eyes. I counted my breaths and let him believe I was asleep. I heard the dresser drawer open. Then close. Footsteps. Soft. Careful. The bedroom door creaked. That was when I sat up. I didn't panic. Panic wastes time. Instead, I reached beneath the mattress and pulled out the small envelope I'd prepared weeks earlier. Inside were copies of everything: insurance documents, bank statements, the anonymous note, even a photocopy of the obituary. I slipped on my robe and followed him down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the carpet. He was in the kitchen. The light above the stove was on. The rest of the room lay in shadow. I could see him standing by the counter, his back to me, holding a glass. Something dark swirled inside it. Harold, I said. He jumped. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, liquid splashing across the tiles. The smell hit me immediately, bitter, chemical, unmistakable. He turned slowly, his face pale. You're awake, he said. Yes, I replied. I am. For a moment neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The house held its breath. Then I placed the envelope on the table between us. I know, I said simply. His eyes dropped to it. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked very old in that moment. Smaller than I remembered. This isn't what you think, he said. I laughed then. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just once, sharp and surprised. Harold, I said, I found my own obituary in your drawer. Silence stretched between us. You planned my death, I continued. You chose a date. You bought a dress. You amended policies. You hid everything because you thought I was too weak, too trusting, too quiet to notice. He sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. I was under pressure, he muttered. The money. I made mistakes. This was the only way to fix it. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but finality. You were willing to kill me, I said, my voice steady, to clean up your mess. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in our marriage he looked afraid. I didn't think you'd find out, he whispered. That, I said, is the truest thing you've said all night. I stepped back toward the door. I've already given copies of everything to my sister, I told him, and to a lawyer. If anything happens to me, this house will be the first place they look. That was a lie, but a necessary one. He didn't try to stop me as I grabbed my coat and keys. He just sat there, staring at the shattered glass on the floor, his perfect plan broken into dangerous pieces. I drove away before dawn, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. I didn't know where I was going yet. Only that I was alive. And for the first time in a long time. The morning after I left felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's life. I slept in my car that first night, parked behind a small roadside motel just outside town. I didn't go inside. I didn't trust walls that weren't mine yet. I wrapped myself in the old blanket from the trunk and watched the sky lighten from deep blue to pale gray. Birds began their morning chatter, unaware that a woman had quietly stepped out of a life meant to end. When the sun finally rose, I realized something simple and astonishing. I was still breathing. I drove to my sister's house by mid-morning. She lived 2 hours away, close enough to reach but far enough that Harold wouldn't come looking immediately. When she opened the door and saw me standing there with my overnight bag and my eyes ringed with exhaustion, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into her arms. We sat at her kitchen table for hours. Coffee grew cold. Toast burned. I told her everything slowly, carefully, afraid the words might collapse if I rushed them. She didn't interrupt. She didn't doubt me. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hands. You did the right thing, she said. Those 5 words felt like medicine. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and quiet grief. I met with a lawyer, an older woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened, nodded, and said something I will never forget. You're not the first woman this has happened to, she said gently. You're just one of the few who noticed in time. That truth landed heavily. Legal proceedings moved slowly as they always do. Harold denied everything, of course. Claimed misunderstandings, stress, poor judgment. He never admitted intent. Men like him rarely do. But the evidence was enough to protect me, to freeze accounts, to ensure he could no longer make decisions on my behalf. Still, freedom came at a cost. I had no income of my own. No recent work history. No house that belonged to me alone. At an age when most women are told to rest, I found myself starting over with nothing but determination and a box of documents. Some people were kind. Others were not. Neighbors whispered. A few church friends avoided my eyes. Someone asked if I was confused or overreacting. I learned quickly how society treats women who disrupt a comfortable story. I downsized my life into a small rented apartment with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. It wasn't pretty, but it was safe. Every night, I locked the door and felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation settle over me. Peace. Money was tight. I learned how to live on less than I ever thought possible. I clipped coupons. I mended clothes instead of replacing them. Pride had no place in survival. But something else began to grow alongside the struggle. Confidence. I took a part-time job at a local thrift shop, sorting donations, organizing shelves, chatting with other women who carried quiet histories of their own. I learned how to use a computer properly. I opened my own bank account. I made decisions without asking permission. Each small victory mattered. My children came around slowly. At first they didn't know what to believe. Harold had always been their steady parent. I was the soft one, the one who smoothed things over. But truth has weight. Over time they saw it. They apologized. They stood beside me. Watching them learn who I really was, not just their mother but a woman who chose life, was worth every lonely night. Some evenings I still sat alone with my thoughts and felt the ache of everything I'd lost. Marriage leaves marks even when it ends badly. But I reminded myself that grief and gratitude can exist together. I had lost a life, but I had saved myself. And in that quiet apartment with its mismatched furniture and borrowed dishes, I began to imagine something new. Not just survival, but purpose. The first few months after leaving Harold were like learning to walk on unfamiliar ground. Every sound startled me, every shadow made me pause, and yet there was a thrill in moving freely, no one dictating what I should think, wear, or say. It was exhausting but exhilarating. I started small. I joined a community center that offered classes for seniors. Cooking, crafting, even basic computer skills. I met women who, like me, had stories tucked behind polite smiles. We shared them cautiously at first, like dipping toes into cold water. Over time we learned to wade together. One day, while arranging shelves of books at the center, I found an old cookbook tucked behind a stack. The spine was worn, pages yellowed, but inside were the recipes I had learned from my mother. The peach pie that had won the county fair, the delicate cookies that melted in your mouth, the hearty soups that warmed cold evenings. Something sparked inside me. A memory of strength, of skill, of joy I had nearly forgotten. I began to cook again. For myself at first. Then for friends. Then for strangers. I started small, baking pies for local events, volunteering in kitchens, and gradually I noticed the smiles that came when someone tasted something I had made. It wasn't just nourishment, it was connection. Each pie, each meal was a way of saying, I am here. I exist. I survived. I also learned how to manage my finances independently. Harold had always kept the accounts, insisting it was simpler that way. Now I balanced budgets, tracked expenses, and even started saving small amounts each month. Each coin, each note was proof of my autonomy. My children watched cautiously at first. They had seen their mother retreat behind the safety of Harold's control for decades. Now they saw me step forward with confidence. They visited more often, asking about my days, my work, my dreams. And for the first time they were surprised by me, not just their mother, but a woman who had reclaimed her life. There were dark days, of course. Nights when memories of the obituary, the envelope, and Harold's calculated smile intruded on my peace. Nights when fear whispered, reminding me of what could have happened. But each time I wrote in my diary. Each time I called my sister. Each time I reminded myself that I was still alive, and that alone was reason enough to move forward. By the end of that year I had a small routine carved out. Morning walks in the park, volunteering at the center, baking in the afternoons, and quiet evenings with a book or my diary. I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't known since my children were small. I was no longer just existing. I was living. And then one afternoon something remarkable happened. The local community center asked if I would teach a small cooking class for seniors. At first I hesitated. Public speaking had never been my forte, and the thought of standing in front of strangers made my hands shake. But something deeper nudged me forward. The knowledge that if I could survive what I had survived, I could teach, guide, and inspire others. The first class was a triumph, if I may say so. We laughed as cookies crumbled, shared stories over pie crusts, and learned from each other. I watched women who had felt invisible find joy in the process, and I realized that my own pain had a purpose: to help others reclaim their own. For the first time in decades, I felt a lightness I thought I'd lost forever. Every small victory, the pie that rose perfectly, the balanced budget, the smiles of my students, was a brick in a new foundation I was building. One where I was not just surviving but thriving. And somewhere in the back of my mind I felt the faintest sense of justice. Harold's plan had failed. My life was no longer his to control. I had turned fear into strength, manipulation into purpose, and grief into empowerment. It would take years to fully reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. But for the first time I believed I could. As the months turned into years, I noticed a subtle shift, not just in myself but in my children. At first they approached cautiously, unsure how to relate to a mother who had suddenly become independent and assertive. They had grown up watching me as a quiet, accommodating figure beside Harold's steady presence. Now I was someone different. Someone capable, self-reliant, and unafraid. It began with small things. My eldest, Karen, started asking for advice about budgeting and saving, something she had never needed before. My middle child, James, confided in me about troubles at work, trusting that I would listen without judgment. And my youngest, Lucy, who had always adored my baking, began helping me in the kitchen, asking questions about recipes, techniques, and the stories behind them. One Sunday afternoon, as the three of them sat in my small kitchen, we baked a batch of peach pies together, the same recipe that had once won me a county fair ribbon decades earlier. Flour dusted their cheeks and laughter filled the tiny space. For the first time in years, the warmth of family felt whole again, even if it had taken chaos to rebuild it. "Mom," Karen said softly, brushing flour from her hair, "I never realized how strong you really are." I smiled, trying not to let my throat tighten. "Strength isn't always loud, dear. Sometimes it's quiet and persistent. It's getting up when you're afraid. It's choosing to live when someone else tries to write your ending." James nodded, understanding more than his words could express. "You saved yourself, Mom. And that gave us a chance to see what real courage looks like." It struck me then that my actions had a ripple effect. By choosing life, by refusing to let Harold dictate my fate, I had given my children a living example of empowerment. They didn't just inherit my survival, they inherited my story, the lessons embedded in every careful, painful choice I had made. Over the next few years, I continued to watch them grow into remarkable adults. Karen launched a small boutique bakery, inspired by our time together in the kitchen. James pursued a career that demanded courage and negotiation, something he admitted he had learned quietly from watching me. Lucy became a teacher, patient and kind, instilling in her students the same values of resilience and self-belief I had taught her, though she never realized it at the time. Evenings at my little apartment were filled with stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. My diary, once a repository of fear and survival, became a place where I chronicled achievements, milestones, and the small joys that make life beautiful. Watching my children blossom, seeing the seeds of courage I had planted take root and flourish, was a reward that softened even the sharpest memories of betrayal. And yet the past lingered. Harold's shadow did not disappear entirely. Occasionally, I would remember the envelope, the storage unit, the obituary. But instead of fear, these memories now fueled a quiet, steady resolve. I had survived him. I had outlived his plans. And that knowledge, deep, unwavering, was empowering. I learned to balance the duality of remembering and letting go. The hurt existed, yes, but it no longer dictated my life. It became a teacher, reminding me of what I had endured and what I could endure still. And in that balance, I found a strange peace, a sense that, despite everything, I had finally reclaimed the story of my life. Sometimes I would sit on my small balcony, the late afternoon sun casting gold across the rooftops, and think about the woman I had once been, the quiet, compliant Doris who never questioned a husband's actions. She felt like a ghost now, but one I acknowledged with compassion. I had loved her once, but I had outgrown her. By empowering myself, I had, in turn, empowered my children. And in their successes, their laughter, their confidence, I found proof that even in the deepest betrayal, life could be reclaimed, and beauty could emerge from the ashes of fear. As the years passed, I discovered that survival alone was not enough. Living fully with joy and purpose required something deeper, reclaiming my identity one choice at a time. After Harold, I realized how much of my life had been dictated by someone else. The quiet woman I had been, always accommodating, always yielding, had to be replaced with someone who understood her worth. I started small. A new haircut. Bright scarves that I had once thought too bold. Afternoon walks through the park without worrying about what Harold would think. I allowed myself to enjoy things I had denied for decades. Old jazz records on Sunday mornings, novels with daring women I could admire, and even the occasional glass of wine without guilt. These small acts of independence were, in themselves, revolutionary. They reminded me that life was mine to live. But the most transformative step came from work and community. My small classes at the community center had expanded beyond cooking. Women began coming to me for advice about independence, financial management, and even self-confidence. I listened, advised, and shared what I had learned from my own ordeal. I realized that my pain had prepared me to help others navigate theirs. In teaching, I found purpose. In helping, I discovered a joy that had been buried under decades of fear. I also began exploring entrepreneurship in ways I had never imagined. Using the skills I had honed raising a family and managing a household, I created a small catering service for local events. Word spread slowly but surely. Soon I was known not just as Doris, Harold's wife, or someone who had survived, but as Dory, the woman who could turn simple ingredients into joy and chaos into calm. Every day I noticed a shift in my own energy. I laughed more freely. I stood taller. I greeted people on the street without second-guessing their motives. I no longer feared my own instincts. They had saved me once and now I trusted them completely. Even my children noticed the change. Karen confided in me about her own struggles running her bakery, and I gave advice not from fear, but from wisdom earned in fire. James called me when negotiating contracts, relying on my calm and reasoning. Lucy sometimes joined me in the kitchen, learning that cooking was not just about food, but about patience, resilience, and attention to detail. And there were moments of quiet, private celebration. I would sit on my balcony in the late afternoon, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sunlight filter through the trees and think, I survived him. I reclaimed my life. I am free. I also came to understand something I hadn't realized before. Empowerment isn't about never being hurt. It's about continuing to move forward despite the hurt, about claiming joy in the small victories. I relearned how to trust myself, how to make decisions for my own well-being, and how to set boundaries that Harold had once crossed without consequence. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at my own reflection in the mirror, a mixture of pride and disbelief in my eyes. The woman who once lived quietly behind someone else's plans was now fully present, alive and confident. It was a gift I hadn't expected to receive after betrayal. And so, slowly life became more than just survival. It became rich with possibility. I traveled when I could, short trips to places I had always dreamed of seeing, often accompanied by friends I had made in the community center. I began documenting recipes, memories, and small stories in a journal, hoping that one day they could inspire someone else who had endured betrayal or fear. I realized that the most powerful gift I could give myself and the world was authenticity. Living true to oneself after years of suppression and betrayal is a radical act. I had been silenced once, but now my voice mattered. My story mattered. And through that voice, I discovered that life, even after the deepest wounds, could still be tender, joyous, and purposeful. The fear that had once dominated my days no longer dictated my future. Instead, hope, courage, and a quiet but unwavering determination guided me forward. In the kitchen at the community center with my children by my side, I realized I had not only survived Harold's plan but had also built a life far richer than the one he had envisioned for me. And that, perhaps, was the most beautiful revenge of all, reclaiming joy, independence, and love not from him but from myself. Even as my life blossomed in ways Harold could never have imagined, there remained quiet wounds beneath the surface, scars from betrayal, from the knowledge that the person I had trusted most had planned my end. They didn't show on the outside. My days were filled with work, laughter, and small successes. But sometimes, when the house was quiet or when I sat alone with my diary, the memories returned with a whisper that carried the weight of years. I realized that healing was not a destination. It was a process, a series of small choices to forgive myself, to reclaim control, and to allow joy to exist alongside the ache. I learned to speak my story aloud, first to my sister, then to friends I trusted, and finally to the community that had begun to embrace me. Every time I recounted the events, the fear and disbelief transformed into clarity and strength. Each retelling was a small exorcism of the past. I also understood that the betrayal I endured was not a reflection of my worth. Harold's actions were his own, shaped by greed, fear, and a desire to control. They had nothing to do with my value, my abilities, or my heart. Coming to this realization was liberating. It allowed me to stop questioning myself, to stop doubting my instincts, and to fully embrace the woman I had become. One of the most profound moments of healing came during a late summer afternoon, as I taught a cooking class for a group of women in their 60s and 70s. We were making apple tarts, the kitchen filled with the rich, comforting aroma of cinnamon and baked fruit. One of the women, a retired nurse named Margaret, turned to me and said softly, "You've lived through something unimaginable, and yet here you are, teaching us, inspiring us. I hope I can be as strong as you one day." Her words stirred something deep inside me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, not from pain but from a sense of completeness. I had transformed my suffering into something tangible, something that could guide and uplift others. The fear that once ruled my life had been replaced with purpose. Healing, I learned, also meant setting boundaries. Harold, despite everything, still attempted to reach out sporadically. Letters, phone calls, occasionally, a visit under the guise of concern. I refused them all. I had learned that survival required not just action but distance from people, situations, and memories that could pull me back into the shadows. I realized that boundaries were not walls meant to isolate but shields meant to preserve. I began journaling more rigorously, not just recounting events, but documenting my feelings, my growth, and my triumphs. I wrote about the fear, yes, but also about the confidence I had cultivated, the joy I had reclaimed, and the love I now allowed myself to feel for my children, for friends, and most importantly for myself. My children noticed the change too. They saw me laugh freely, make decisions without hesitation, and step into spaces I had once feared. They admired not just the life I had rebuilt, but the woman I had become. It was a quiet pride, but it radiated warmth through our interactions. Karen often hugged me after a long day at her bakery and whispered, "You taught me how to survive, and now I want to thrive like you." James and Lucy echoed similar sentiments in their own ways, affirming that the legacy of resilience was living through them. Even as I healed, I did not forget. The memories of Harold's betrayal remained, like shadows at the edge of my vision. But shadows cannot harm if you do not turn to face them. I acknowledged the darkness, let it exist, and then moved forward, letting light fill the spaces that fear had once occupied. By the end of this phase of healing, I realized something profound. Surviving a betrayal of this magnitude is not merely about living day to day. It is about choosing to create meaning from the chaos, to build joy from the rubble, and to embrace life with a clarity that fear could never achieve. And so, as the years continued to unfold, I found myself not just surviving or even thriving, but living fully, with gratitude for the lessons, courage forged in fire, and the quiet knowledge that my story, though dark at moments, was now entirely my own. Looking back now, decades later, I can trace the contours of my life like a well-worn map, with dark valleys of fear and betrayal and bright peaks of courage and joy. I am Doris, or Dory as my friends call me, a woman who once thought she could be controlled, silenced, even written out of existence, yet somehow found her way back into the light. I often sit on my balcony in the late afternoons, the sun spilling gold across the rooftops, and think about that moment when I first found my obituary in Harold's drawer. The paper was cold, sterile, and utterly final. It was meant to terrify me, to freeze me into compliance, to make me doubt my own instincts. But instead, it awakened something I hadn't realized I had all along: the quiet, stubborn will to live fully, fiercely, and freely. The years since then have been a tapestry of small victories. I built a life that Harold could not touch. I reclaimed my independence, found purpose in teaching, created joy through cooking, and strengthened the bonds with my children. I watched them blossom into remarkable adults, carrying forward not just my genes but my courage. Each pie baked, each story shared, each laugh enjoyed was a tiny defiance against the life that had been planned for me. And yet, I never let the past poison the present. I learned that holding on to anger or bitterness only prolongs suffering. I acknowledged the betrayal, mourned the years stolen, and then turned my energy toward growth, love, and the creation of a life that reflected my own choices. There is freedom in that, an unshakable, gentle freedom that cannot be taken by anyone, no matter how carefully they plan. To the women watching this, to anyone who has felt powerless, I want to say this: your story is yours to write, no matter how dark the beginning. Betrayal can attempt to define you, fear can try to hold you back, and society may doubt you, but the strength inside you is far greater than you realize. You can rebuild. You can thrive. You can reclaim joy. Sometimes my mind drifts to Harold. I do not hate him because hatred would trap me in the past. I understand him only as a man who chose control over love, fear over empathy. My pity is quiet, my forgiveness cautious, and my boundaries firm. He exists in my past, not in my present. My life now belongs to me entirely, and that is a gift I will never relinquish. When I look at my children, my students, my friends, and even the women I mentor at the community center, I see the ripple effect of reclaiming my life. Courage spreads quietly, subtly, in ways that cannot be measured by money or status. It spreads in confidence, laughter, and resilience. It spreads in living authentically without apology. And that, my dear friends, is the most profound victory of all. So now I share this story with you not to shock, not to frighten, but to remind you that life, even after betrayal and fear, can be reclaimed. You are not powerless. You are not defined by the actions of others. Your choices matter. Your voice matters. And your life, every precious, fleeting day, is yours to shape. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touches you, inspires you, or even just reminds you of your own strength, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, or subscribe. There are countless stories out there waiting to be told, and sometimes the bravest act is simply to say, "This is my life. I will live it fully." Because after surviving something meant to destroy me, after stepping away from the shadow of betrayal, I can finally say it with certainty. I am alive, I am free, and I am wholly, unashamedly me. Doris Story Whitmore.